greater than today.
Your channel of choice. You're watching the Lunchtime Chat. I'm your host, Daisy Mukukamlenga. Now, I keep saying this, we keep having interesting conversations relating to issues that are pretty much of public interest. And today is no exception, because today's topic is centering around, I think, the current thing that's going on, the debt restructuring process. Now, I want us to understand in depth this time around, because yes, it's one thing to hear about debt restructuring, but it's another thing entirely to know what it is about. Before I introduce today's guest, I just want you to be, in focus with today's conversation. So I'll just read out a few, or rather brief background relating to today's conversation. Now, a deal to restructure 6.3 billion United States dollars in debt that is owed to international governments has been struck by Zambia. China being the largest official creditor to Zambia, with 4.1 billion United States dollars owed to Export and Import Bank of China alone. Now, China being the largest, like I said, creditor to Zambia, with 4.1 billion owed to the Export Import Bank of China alone. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Zambia became the first country to default on its sovereign debt and has struggled since then. Recently, the Republican President Hakainde Hichilema wrote via his Twitter platform, "Zambia has reached an agreement on a debt treatment with our official creditors, a significant milestone in our journey towards economic recovery growth." Now, these were the words of our president. So today's topic, like I said, is bordering around the debt restructuring process. And I do have in the studio Mr. Mwiya Ikabongo. I hope I pronounced his surname correctly. And he's coming from the Policy Monitoring Research Center, and he's a research associate. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You're welcome to Lunchtime Chat.
Thank you very much.
Did I pronounce your surname correctly?
My first name is Ikabongo, but it's okay.
Wait, Mwiya is surname,
yes.
So it was correct.
Yeah, it's okay.
All right, so yeah. Every time I hear about your organization, I see it as people that understand the restructuring of debt quite clearly, better than some of us, right? So it's quite an honor to know that today we'll broaden our intellectual capabilities when it comes to understanding the debt restructuring process. But before we dive into today's conversation, maybe what I would want us to understand is, what is the mandate of your organization?
So we are a think tank. We are an organization that is created to help government undertake transparent and accurate policies that help us achieve the goals that we have settled. Usually a country will have a set of macroeconomic policies and goals and targets that you want to achieve. As PMRC, we are mandated to help the Ministry of Finance and other related government institutions to try and ensure that the policies that are implemented actually have a positive outcome that we desire to have.
Interesting. Now, back to the issue that we're talking about, debt restructuring. I know we've been hearing this since we heard of the issue of the debt that Zambia has. But I do know to say people don't pretty much understand what it is. So maybe explain to us what debt restructuring is.
So to restructure a debt just means modifying the terms and conditions of the debt. So we borrowed money, and this borrowing actually was so large that the growth in the amount of money that we borrowed relative to the size of our economy was actually the rate at which we borrowed was growing faster than the growth in the economy. And the coming in of COVID-19 in 2020 saw Zambia fail to pay, one of the first African countries to fail to pay, meaning defaulting on the debt. And the current government has been working actually from the time they assumed office. They've been working to try and achieve a modified way of changing the terms and conditions of the debt. So you can say, well, I owe money, so much money, and I'm not able to pay it now. But what I can do is change the terms and conditions that are associated with it. This can be changing the interest rate, for instance. You know how much the amount that you pay for the debt that you contracted. So you can change that maybe to a lower one, or you can lengthen the time that you pay back the debt. And in the case of Zambia, what we've done is to ask for 3 years from the lenders, that the 3 years we can have some sort of a breathing space to be able to undertake projects that would see government develop the capacity to pay back the remaining debt. So it's not cancellation, that's another way in which you can go. I think we achieved something like that with the IMF and World Bank in 2005 under Manawasa. That's a different case, but the current case is that we have negotiated that we are given some more time to repay the debt. So we've just changed terms and conditions of the debt.
Okay, so we still have to pay. We just have some lenience in terms of time.
So yes, so we have been allowed some more time to pay back. This allows us to be able to undertake certain economic activities that were limited by the budget, much of it going towards the repayment.
Interesting. Now for an ordinary citizen, on a scale of 1 to 10, how huge is Zambia's debt?
Well, the debt, like I mentioned when I started, I said that at one point, the growth in our debt to ordinary Zambians, you can understand it, the growth at the rate at which we are borrowing was higher than the growth in the size of the economy. So I'm trying to use those terms because I think that is easily understood. Yes.
So it's pretty much above 10, literally.
Yeah, so in short, our economy was growing lower than the growth in the debt, simply put. And that was going to hamper a lot of projects, like government activities were going to shrink. Also growth, our ability to undertake certain projects as a country, being able to engage in international trade, stabilizing macroeconomic variables and so on, those were going to be very difficult to achieve. So stabilizing or actually achieving this debt restructuring leads to a more stable macroeconomic environment in the country.
Interesting. Now, I would like to also understand what role the foreign exchange will play in relation to maintaining a stable economic performance following the restructured debt.
From what we've seen, just as a response, our market is quite responsive to what is happening right now. And it's an indicator that our economy is as competitive and open as it can be. What we have seen is that any changes on the international market, we see the response being reflected in a number of variables. And one of them is the exchange rate that you're trying to explain there. And from what we have seen, the exchange rate has responded when this pronouncement has been made. And once it was made, I think that was a few days ago, last week, you saw that change actually, the kwacha starting to gain value. Now, we are predominantly an import-oriented country, meaning most of our commodities are imported. And a stable exchange rate, a strong kwacha against other currencies, especially the US dollar, means we are able to buy goods and services from outside the country and at a lower, you can get as much as you want if you have a stronger currency than when you have a weaker currency. So the role that the exchange rate is playing is to try and see that effect, the stability in the exchange rate market, being reflected into other sectors. Agriculture, mining, we should be able to buy equipment, machinery to continue with the production so that we stabilize our currency and develop capacity to pay back the debt.
Okay, so what you are bringing out clearly, if we won't be tactful in how we do this particular restructuring, the economy may equally shrink somehow. So how would you advise government what needs to be done to achieve a restructuring of the remaining debt so as to give our economy some breathing space?
So there are a number of proposals that have been done. Of course, we have just dealt with the bilateral lenders, country to China and a few others. The majority of our lenders are actually in the private sector. And it's quite difficult to engage this, but I'm not saying that it's not doable. We can actually start, and I'm sure the government already has taken some steps to ensure that we engage the private lenders as well. Because these lenders, If they give us even another better deal than what we currently have, that would be good for Zambia. And in the meantime, as Zambia, we can take advantage of the grace period that we have been given to grow the economy so that we are able to develop that strong capacity to pay back the loans and ensure that it doesn't become a problem. If we look at how it has been in the past few years, most of our macroeconomic conditions on the market have been unstable. And this is attributed to the huge debt that we contracted as a country. So developing capacity today will not only give us that chance to grow our economy, but also make us more sustainable in the economy.
I heard you say if we're given a better deal, that would be better. Now, is there any other means that can be better if it's not cancellation alone?
Well, cancellation is the last thing, but you know, about debt restructuring, you also need to look at the fact that they are creditors, and you need to be fair to the creditors. The stage at which we had reached was such that it was either we are not going to pay back, we default completely and become a bad debt, or they can get the least that they can get from us. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So with that, debt restructuring is a deal that enables us to still be fair to our creditors, because they gave us some of these houses, you know, and many different financial houses. So you cannot, support, if you really think about fairness, support a case of cancellation, because their pensions are waiting for their money. Their shareholders that are waiting for their money. So you want to get the best deal for the country, for instance, lengthen the period of time that we need to repay, reduce the interest rate. They will still get their money, but this is like the minimum that they could get from the deal. Because we were at the verge of actually having not paying at all. Yes. Yeah, that's possible for actually not only Zambia, but many other countries.
Okay. You know, I've always wondered, before I even go to the next question, in an event where a country fails to pay debt, what gets to happen really?
If you look at, in terms of these financial instruments that you use to get debt, one of the most safe ones is government. So you lend to government, you are sure that the money will be paid to you, because government will always be in existence, unless probably in a case of a failed state. But we know that the risk of defaulting completely is almost non-existent for a country, because you always have a government there.
Yeah.
But the returns also are quite low on these instruments that are coming from government. And in a case where we fail to pay completely, we have seen certain cases, for instance, Sri Lanka, where the government has now more like given China the mandate to run the property, the investment that is existing in their country for a long time now, for a given period of time, so as a way for China to generate the money that they lent to Sri Lanka, that country. So those are cases where you can have a bilateral agreement with another country, of course, on whether, if you are not able to pay, then what assets do you have that can be used in lieu of the debt.
It's interesting. Clearly, this debt issue is more than what meets the eye. Now, let's talk about fiscal deficit, right? Given the IMF, what can we expect to happen to Zambia's fiscal deficit in relation to building confidence in the financial market players?
Okay, so in the case of Zambia, we are waiting for the budget, which usually comes out in October. It tells the state of the budget in terms of our spending and our revenue. But linking the fiscal deficit or the budget deficit to our current debt struggle, there's a link, but we shouldn't focus so much on it, because that one is mainly on issues to do with our planned spending for a fiscal year, of course. But if we have persistent deficits, our capacity to pay back is also limited. Yeah. Yes, of course. But I think I would like to look at them in isolation, in that as much as we may speak of government deficit or for a given financial year, that might not be the same case in the subsequent years. So yes, of course, it will hamper your ability to undertake certain activities now, but in the long run or in the subsequent years, you might actually be able to turn that around and be able to achieve what you wanted to.
So earlier on, we did mention that what
just
we
on
have.
that, actually,
Okay.
I would like
Another
to say
thought
that,
has come.
yeah. One of the ways in which government can manage that is to limit its spending. You've seen most of the governments actually limiting how much they are spending. You cut it. Most of the conditionalities coming from IMF and World Bank are aimed at limiting or curtailing the size of government spending. And from what I have seen, you see that when we have a deficit, government will try to achieve that. But there are so many competing needs on the market. You need to develop the health sector, you need to develop the agriculture sector, you have so many spending channels. So that is not something that really sits well with many of us, in the sense that already government has a lot of things to do in terms of achieving the level of spending that is desired for the economy. However, one of the channels through which you can finance the deficit or try to reduce the deficit is to cut back your spending. But we don't talk about that now because of the factors that I've given above. Yes.
Okay, so I was going to say, and maybe just on government spending, do you also think it's a doable thing to cut down on spending with the issues that you've just raised, looking at what other things government needs to take care of? Is it?
Yeah, I just stated that, we can't cut back government spending. But some of the conditionalities that come from these creditors are such that you need to limit your spending. You've had, I think after 2015 up to about 2021, we had something called the wage freeze. That's a way to try and limit. But now when you look at the current government, they've gone ahead and actually in a way expand spending. You look at CDF increasing over 100%. You have the free education, you have issues to do with agriculture, and many other projects for government that have been undertaken. So in a way, to speak about limiting spending and you want to develop capacity to pay back the debt, I think that will not be in line with what you want to get at the end of the day. Yes.
Well put. Now, we did make mention to say what Zambia currently has is not debt cancellation, right? So what policy directions do you think government should undertake if we have to have productivity in Zambia?
So increased productivity, that's one of the key goals, of course. When the private sector is empowered, from an economic point of view, especially macroeconomics, you want to ensure that the private sector is able to grow. And once the private sector has grown to a level that it's able to support the projects that government is undertaking through taxation and many other means, you will see that at the end of the day, you are moving towards the targets that you have set as a country. So one of the policy directions that government should undertake, of course, is ensuring that we create an environment which is permissible to the private sector. Ensure that the private sector is not choked, is able to undertake its projects without difficulties. So you remove difficulties in registration, difficulties in, there are so many regulations that can hamper the growth in investment. So you want to create a market that, I think, just to bring something here, the MFES, multinational, whatever, economic zone, you know about the economic zones, where we encourage local investors and foreign investors to come into a particular space to be able to trade, and you give them maybe tax concessions, subsidies, and so on. These are ways in which you want to ensure that the private sector grows, because we know efficiency can be achieved in the economy if we empower the private sector, and government cannot go and give money to the private sector, but create conditions or policies that enable the private sector to grow.
Now, we did default in 2020, and the reason obviously was the pandemic. We don't even know if it's totally squashed or it could come back again. How do you think we can still survive this particular debt so that we don't default as we did in 2020?
So there were a number of conditions, factors that led to the default in 2020. Like you clearly mentioned, the pandemic. But also the growth in our debt was higher than, like I mentioned, the rate was quite high for a developing country like Zambia. the pandemic did not lead to any economic advantage, especially to countries that are in sub-Saharan Africa, and many others actually, including the global powers. The pandemic limited the level of exports, the level of imports, the level of economic transactions, because people were locked up. If you remember, there was a time when we had, not only in Zambia, but across the globe, when we had those lockdowns. When you are not able to buy and sell, your spending is someone's income. So when that is not happening, you are shrinking the level of income in the economy. So to avoid that in the future, this is why we are talking about what policy directions should be taken, what policies should be taken. For instance, apart from expanding the production capacity of local firms, increasing the business, improving the business environment, creating an environment where the private sector is able to thrive with limited or no government intervention. Of course, we know in reality government is just trying to enter the market and intervene once in a while. But create an environment where the private sector is able to thrive, and this should enable us to be able to create enough capacity to counter any challenges that come with repayment.
Okay. Now, Zambia's plan in terms of mining is to produce 3 million tons of copper per year. Now, I want to understand how this can help sustain this particular restructured debt.
We are a mineral wealth country, and I think only Congo within our region has more minerals than we do. Yes, especially when it comes to copper, cobalt, and many other. Generally, sub-Saharan Africa is actually endowed with a lot of mineral wealth, and at Zambia, that's one of the areas that we can focus on in terms of achieving growth. So we could make more investment in the mining sector. Just from what I've seen, what we could do as a country is to make more explorations, invest in mapping the resources in the country. We do not know. It's only about a few years ago that we discovered copper in Lower Zambias. There are many other areas within Zambia that have all these resources. Because we have not done enough explorations, we have not done the mapping of the minerals that we have. It's only in future that when other people come and then say, no, you have copper here, that's when you start mining there. So increasing our capacity of production can only be motivated by explorations. So let's know where our minerals are. And I feel, of course, Ministry of Mines is doing enough, but I think they could increase their capacity to explore more and try to map where the resources are, and then attract foreign direct investment to come and do the mining, or even government itself. But we know what came out from nationalization of mines and whatnot. Those are issues we could talk another day. But in a way, what I'm trying to say is that we could do more mapping for our resources. And once we know, we attract people to come and do the investment, or we partner with them as they come to do the investment in mining here. So the mining sector is not the only sector that can help us repay the debt. We have so many areas that we can diversify into. Agriculture is one of the key ministries that we have seen, especially of late. We have seen that the government is beginning to appreciate, although it has been the case, but it's beginning to appreciate that particular ministry because of the potential it has. I want to mention, I think earlier, late last, when we had so much demand for maize across here in DRC and many other neighboring countries, we couldn't take advantage of that. But in many cases, what you noticed was government trying to create barriers to trade. So you say no exporting the maize. What we could do is expand the capacity of production and export, because that's a potential market. But that's, of course, something that we could go into details. There are many other issues to do with the food security and other related issues. Yes.
Great. Speaking of sectors, yes, you've made mention of other avenues that can help us generate money to pay off this debt. Now, I would want to understand what impact the restructured debt will have on these particular sectors that you've mentioned: agriculture, the education sector, and other sectors as well. What impact will it have?
So the debt restructuring deal is important in that we are freeing up government spending space. So you are supposed to pay, let's say, you get paid 10,000 kwacha, I'm just saying, an assumption. And then you, out of this 10,000 kwacha you need to pay 5,000 kwacha in debt. So assume that is government. And someone says, okay, you will not pay this 5,000 kwacha. I will give you some time so that you can develop capacity to pay back later on. So with that, this deal that we have achieved as a country is actually massive in that we can use the 3-year period that we've been given to develop enough capacity in different sectors. I mentioned agriculture, mining, manufacturing. We can grow our economy in all different sectors. Tourism is one of the areas that we have so much potential. We have one of the 7 wonders of the world right here in Zambia. It's not the only thing. So we have so many sectors that we could develop and ensure that when the time comes for us to continue with the repayment, we'll have developed enough capacity. And this does not only depend on government, it also depends on the private sector. What I think should be done is that the private sector should be given enough environment, enough capacity or freedom to pursue their own interests, while of course within the guidelines of the ministries that are aligned with those particular businesses. But at the same time, we should enable the private sector have the capacity to grow more and be able to achieve the growth that we intend to see. Because once the private sector is able to grow, and we know the efficiency comes from that side, then it will translate into us having this capacity, this enormous capacity to pay back the debt. So it starts from there. Create policies that encourage private sector business, private sector participation. Reduce, government meddling, especially in things to do with the market. But we're not saying government should not be there in terms of certain interventions, controlling pollution, taxation. No, we understand those things, social, economic policies, and so on. That is one of the mandates for government. But the private sector should be given enough leverage to develop itself and be able to grow beyond what we have seen. And that is something that we can actually achieve as a country.
Great. Even as we wind up, Mr. Mwiya, firstly, before I even ask for your final thoughts, when a country is deciding on borrowing these huge monies from international governments, do they do that with intent of maybe financing a certain project? Because I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of you borrow money and yet it just goes wherever, then you've not produced anything to ensure that you're able to settle that particular payment. Let me give you an example. If I come to say, I want to borrow money from you, in my mind, obviously, maybe I have a business plan. So much so I borrow, I'll put that money into my business and then pay you back. So maybe from the government's perspective, what really happens for a government to find itself in such huge debt?
Okay, so not to label others in a negative way, but up to where we are today, that mechanism was open and there was no clear outline on how much could be borrowed. And what has been developed right now is a debt ceiling, a limit on how much you can borrow as a government. So this is coming to effect in, of course, in 2027. Yeah, so we still have that space to borrow as much as possible. But ideally, outside that, borrowing should be, you cannot borrow like to finance consumption, overstretched consumption. You cannot borrow because you want to, to please a particular sector of people, for instance, cadres or whatever it is, print t-shirts and whatnot. It's quite invasive to say this on live TV, but most of the ways through which we accounted debt was not very prudent. We need to have a structure in a way that allows us to borrow for particular projects. Right now, our neighbors, DRC, is constructing one of the main dams, one of the largest power suppliers in the world. Actually, they are going to surpass China. And money borrowed for that cause is going to see DRC be able to power over 12 countries in Africa. And this is what we want to see also for Zambia, that when you borrow, you should have a cause in mind. You should have a reason for borrowing, and this borrowing should be around ensuring that you are borrowing for productivity, for production, not for consumption. Yes, of course, there are justifications when you can borrow for consumption because you want to meet certain targets, but usually we want to borrow for investment to expand our capacity to produce. So you borrow these huge sums of money just to please a few individuals may not be good. But of course, we know some of the borrowing in the past, not to undermine the borrowing, some of the borrowing was justified. Like we can see some infrastructure, especially in our towns and our roads that we're able to see. These are some of the things that we say are justified because the borrowing has had some positive investment impact on the economy. But again, you have another type of borrowing which does not exclude even the current government. We hope that the borrowing that is going to be done or is being done is one that is intended to enhance investment in the country.
Interesting, and I think it is a lesson, even not just from national level, even on a personal kind or individual level, it is a lesson of not borrowing for consumption unless it's justifiable. On that note, do you have any final words?
Well, thank you very much. I think much of what we needed to talk has been exhausted. Yes, thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you so much for coming. It's been uplifting to learn. I think I've learned 1, 2, or 3 new things that I didn't know before this interview. So thank you for making time.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay, so that's a wrap for today's lunchtime chat. I've been in the studio with somebody who's pretty much an expert when it comes to dissecting issues to deal with debt restructuring. I hope that your knowledge has equally been broadened, just like mine has. Please do stay tuned to the finest television station and tune in tomorrow again for another exciting episode of the Lunchtime Chat. Bye-bye for now.